this is a Congress that can control Lula. And also you have to consider that the governors in the three major states in Brazil, São Paulo, Minas, and Rio de Janeiro, they are also from the Bolsonaro supporters or Bolsonaro-esque supporters. So Lula will have to pass legislation there. He has a lot of ways to constrain him. Maybe the concern now is whether, because Lula will have like at least two nominations for the Supreme Court, which can sway some of the Supreme Court to the left, but I think it's not going to be a cakewalk for Lula at any point, and some legislation needs to be passed. For instance, Brazil needs a new fiscal framework. It's important, and it needs to be credible, because if it's not, markets will punish Brazil.
Let's try and look a bit ahead. We take the election result for granted. Lula da Silva will take office as the next president in Brazil, 1st of January, as far as I'm concerned, right? Next year.
Yes.
So, I mean, Lula da Silva, he's been a talking point for institutional investors globally for a while. We've obviously had periods of presidency with Lula before in Brazil. He last took office before the financial crisis and left office in 2011 and had a court case against him in the meanwhile until today. So do you think it is fair that institutional investors globally, they care so much about the prospects of Lula becoming the next president?
Yes, and I think it's important to highlight that I do think that this Lula government will be closer to the first and not the second, because there's a big difference between both. Either because, when the financial crisis happening, it was like he actually found it, he actually had the moment to like boost public spending and all. Maybe it made sense at this moment, like being a counter-cyclical type of economics, but that created most of the problems that were exacerbated when Dilma Rousseff, his successor, also from his PT, really like she completely shattered the public coffers, doing a lot of poor economic decisions. So Lula, in that case, in the sense, will be closer to Lula one when he was kind of an unknown commodity, and he actually had to say, okay, I will be playing under the fiscal guidelines rules. I will be using like the tripod of the macroeconomic tripod, which basically says like primary surpluses, floating FX rate. And so he had. So I think it's going to be closer to the first, not because Lula completely understood and PT understood that they made a mistake when Dilma was president, but because he needs to, because he doesn't have the Congress support to do a left-wing type of government. He will face a sturdy opposition in Congress, and if he tries to do some sort of rollback reforms that were taken, he will lose at Congress. So he really needs to be, it's more of a survival tactic than they fully understanding their mistakes and trying to redo what worked best. So I think at this moment, in this sense, I think global investors will be pleased to hear this, because there are lots of ways to constrain a Lula government, a more of a some state growing and state companies type of government that Dilma took. It's probably he can't do this. He doesn't have either the funds or the support to do so. So it's going to be a more of a centrist type of government, any way you slice it.
Let's try and spend a few minutes understanding the national Congress system in Brazil and what's possible for the next Lula presidency. We know that Lula has quite radical plans. At least he's been very vocal about such plans earlier in his career. But the National Congress obviously needs to be on board. How similar is this system to the US election system and the presidency and the Congress in the US? Please explain.
Yeah, the difference is when being a bipartisan system in the U.S., you basically when you have a majority of your party, you just roll and pass almost everything you want. You may have some negotiations here and there in some issues, but you have the support to do so. And which, for instance, when you get Europe and most of the parliamentary system, you're just there because you have a majority. So that creates an easier way to understand politics and public policy. In Brazil, is different. In Brazil, you have it's reducing the type of fragmentation, party fragmentation, but you still have a lot of parties in Brazil, and to rule. Most you have to have there are different types of legislation needs a different number of votes. So when you in Brazil, it's very common. There's what we call in Brazil a centrão, which poorly translates to big center. It's basically like a bulk of centrist parties, which are what would I call? They are fluid ideologically, which means they are not. They could be closer to a left-wing government, just as they could be closer to a right-wing government, and they will provide votes in Congress for legislation. So in that sense, you would say, okay, Lula could have, as easy as Bolsonaro, he could find a majority there with this kind of centrist parties, clientelist parties, if you may, because there's a lot of pork and patronage being doled out to pass legislation in Brazil. The problem is now we had like in this election, we had a right-wing shift, in Congress, which it was harder than I expected, this shift. I always thought it was going to happen, but what I do think, and this is something that's bad for business, is that there was a shift, but in a poorer quality of Congress, in terms of those people are really not concerned with reforms as much as they are concerned with culture wars. So it's poorly comparison for the American audience. It was like you had a right-wing shift. Instead of getting more Mitch McConnells, you got more Major Taylor Greens. So you got people that are less. I really don't know how can I put this in a Europe perspective. Maybe more of a Nigel Farage's than Liz Truss's. I don't know. Maybe. But having said that, those guys will be oppositors to Lula, whichever he does. But the centrists, even the centrist parties, they are. I think they are a little more tilted to the right in terms of their ideology. So it's not like they will just accept anything that comes from Lula and form a ruling coalition, expecting some sort of, like I said, pork and patronage, and just no. They will have they will have a say into what Lula can and cannot pass. So some of those radical policies, for instance, rolling back the labor reform, that they do this because, Workers' Party. So you have this kind of support from unions. And so even like the guys from unions, and usually those guys, the PT grew in Congress this year, but actually they grew gaining seats that were already from left-wing parties, maybe center-left parties, but it's not like they gain from the center to center-right. So Lula will need to go to those guys. It's not like they are in a comfortable position in which they do not need to seek Lula desperately. Lula needs to seek them. So it's going to make a lot of policy. Lula needs to go to those guys and actually have policy passed on their terms and not on Lula's terms. And this is why I think, even if I think it was of a poorer quality, the Congress, it actually makes for a better. You can. This is a Congress that can control Lula, And also you have to consider that the governors in the three major states in Brazil, São Paulo, Minas, and Rio de Janeiro, they are also from the Bolsonaro supporters or Bolsonaro-esque supporters. So Lula will have to pass legislation there. He has a lot of ways to constrain him. Maybe the concern now is whether, because Lula will have like at least two nominations for the Supreme Court, which can sway some of the Supreme Court to the left, but I think it's not going to be a cakewalk for Lula at any point, and some legislation needs to be passed. For instance, Brazil needs a new fiscal framework. It's important, and it needs to be credible, because if it's not, markets will punish Brazil.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.